Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Plus Yara webinar. I'm really pleased to be there today to moderate this webinar on the implications of the COVID-19 crisis for rural production, food systems, and livelihoods in Southern Africa. So our presenters today are part of the YARA small grant program on COVID-19 and African food systems across 15 African countries, of which working papers from this program will be made available soon on the YARA website. But first, a few words about YARA. YARA is the Young African Researchers in Agriculture Network. It was launched in 2014, and it brings together young and early career researchers in agriculture from all over the continent in a new peer network. So currently, the central coordination of the network is hosted at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, PLAS, at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. And today we have three brilliant panelists coming from Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. They conducted this research that they will be presenting today as part of the small grant network, as I just mentioned. What about the topic of today's webinar? As demonstrated by some research conducted already, COVID-19 is likely to cause significant disruption on production and food systems in rural communities across Africa and deepen the hardship already experienced by vulnerable rural people. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, warns that Africa could face a crisis within a crisis, in which the health crisis will be exacerbated by a hunger crisis, among other crises. This would create a vicious feedback loop, which could leave rural poor people weaker and more susceptible to the virus. While it will take time to understand the full scope of COVID-19 impact on food systems and livelihoods, there is an urgent need for deeper and meaningful understanding of the protracted implications of COVID-19 for African food systems and agriculture. This webinar of the COVID-19 for African food systems this webinar presents real-time insight into how the crisis is unfolding in different parts of the Southern African region and how rural production is responding in different contexts. The main questions that we will seek to address today are, first, how small-scale farmers have been affected by the pandemic in terms of production and marketing, and what are their responses and the way they see the future. Secondly, we will try and understand the social impact of COVID-19 and implication for household and food security. And finally, how are the states responding to the COVID-19 crisis, and how is this reconfiguring the agrarian transformation in the region? So now let me introduce our speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Nkumbu Nalwimba. Nkumbu holds a PhD in Rural Development and Management from China Agricultural University and researches foreign aid, agricultural investment, farmer input program and value chains, political economy, capitalism and land governance. She works as a senior agricultural officer for the Ministry of Agriculture in Zambia in the Department of Agribusiness and Marketing. She was a research fellow for the International Poverty Reduction Center in China, IPRCC, from August 2016 to July 2017. Her research articles have been published in the Journal of Peasant Studies, GeoJournal, among other journals. Welcome, Nkumbu. Our second speaker will be Ms. Loveness Msofi Mgala-Madzi. Loveness is a lecturer in Extension and Rural Development at Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources with the Extension Department since November 2014. She is currently a PhD candidate in Land and Agrarian Studies at PLAS at the University of Western Cape. She worked with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security between 2009 and 2014. She also briefly worked as a secondary teacher from 2008 to 2009. Her research focuses on agricultural extension and rural development, land and agrarian change, gender and social differentiation, and livelihood analysis. Loveness holds a master's degree in agribusiness management in 2002 from National Pingtung University Science of Technology in Taiwan. She holds a BSc degree in agricultural extension from the Bunda College of Agriculture, University of Malawi. Welcome, Loveness. Glad to have you with us. Our third speaker will be Ms. Charity Nyasa Ruzere. She's a PhD student with PLAS at the University of Western Cape. Her research analyzes comparative differences existent in agrarian change and social differentiation patterns in small-scale farmers after Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform program. Her interests are in rural development, livelihood, and land and agrarian issues, among others. So the three papers you will hear about shortly appear to complement each other. Our first speaker, Nkumbu, focuses on the macro level analysis or the macro level impact of COVID-19 on the wider society. She explores how the lockdown in agri-produce supplier countries and routes has presented a window of opportunity for Zambian farmers, and how the smallholder farmers have utilized such an opportunity, and also how the state propped up a rhetoric of local farmer empowerment around the outbreak of COVID-19. The study is based on interviews with key informants, with farmer representative organizations, and key ministerial departments. The study draws the participants from Lusaka and Ndola, which are major cities in Zambia and have the highest number of large retailer chains. Our second speaker's presentation, Ms. Loveness Mugalamadzi, offers a meso-level analysis by focusing on how measures implemented to prevent the spread of COVID-19 worked at national, community, household, and individual levels, and how they affect social interaction and consequently food security at household level. The study was conducted in the semi-urban areas of several districts with main focus on Lilongwe and Blantyre, using qualitative methods mainly to collect data through a mail-out questionnaire using Google Form platform and phone calls. Loveness will share more with us about her findings. And the final speaker, Ms. Charity Ruzere, considers the micro level or the household level by looking at the impact of the Zimbabwe fast-track land reform program in Goromonzi district, Mashonaland, East Province of Zimbabwe, since March 2020. She uses mixed research methods and a comparative case study approach to compare different districts to draw an insight on production and marketing trends in Zimbabwe. So this is really an exciting panel we have here, and I'm really looking forward to hear the findings from all our panelists. But before giving the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Nkumbu, may I please ask you to put all your comments on the chat box. Throughout this event, you can communicate with us by posting your questions as comments. And also, may I ask all the webinar participants to please check in by typing the country where you are based. We will be very pleased to hear from you. The live Q&A function is enabled throughout the event, so please feel free to ask your questions in French or in English, and I will translate them accordingly. And finally, please use the hashtag COVID-SADC Food System should you want to tweet about this event. So now over to our first speaker, Dr. Nkumbu, if she is with us. So we have lost Nkumbu. Dr. Loveness, over to you for the first presentation, and we'll have Nkumbu after you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rama, for the introduction. Well, not yet doctor, but very soon. Okay. So, like you've mentioned, I present a case of Malawi in the response to COVID-19. So Malawi took a different course in response, because what happened was we didn't actually have an actual lockdown because it was contested. The government proposed that we have a national lockdown due to COVID, but the idea was opposed, and there were issues to do with the government, and as a country as a whole, we are not prepared to go into lockdown. especially for people who couldn't afford to get food, who most of the times work on what we call a hand-to-mouth basis. So a lockdown was kind of a no-go zone at all. So with that, despite the opposition only winning the fact that it even went to court, the fact that the country should not go on lockdown. But what was seen or what was being observed is that at individual level, household level, even I could say some companies did implement some measures to actually control the spread of COVID-19. So my focus was to look at what were the impacts of these measures, because they brought about some unprecedented, I should say, behaviors that actually reduced interactions among people, and also we would call it like people couldn't meet. So these measures varied. For example, one of the measure was staying at home. So many people implemented staying at home measure on their own, enforcing it at household level, letting their children not move out of the house and be able to control. Another measure was wearing face masks, which was very common, and this was also implemented at I would say countrywide, because you couldn't access most of the services if you don't have a face mask on. And other measures to do with working from home, implementing hygiene practices, washing hands, and all that. And it was actually a norm that each and every place you go, you would find facilities where you could wash your hands and also use hand sanitizer. Now, my focus was to look at what are the social issues that are coming up with these measures altogether. This was at the backdrop of understanding that most studies have looked at the economic impacts of COVID-19, but not much on how is the reduced, I mean, how are these measures impacting on household level activities, more especially in their access to food. So, for example, if we look at the issue of staying at home, one thing that it brought was there was reduced interaction and social networking among peers, among friends, among, I would say, even those people who we could access some opportunities. So, what was coming out from the study was that the reduced interaction has actually reduced opportunities for people to do business, for people to actually get opportunities to earn income. So in that way, the income level at household level was reducing because most people couldn't do face-to-face interaction. Yeah. And most of the times this face-to-face interaction, for example, other respondents would say, I couldn't go to meet up with the people in the rural communities. Hence, I'm only depending on salaries and I can't get an allowance, which is an extra income which helps people to access food. That was one of the things. The other thing was there was also reduced interaction with parents and relatives. So for this one, one of the things that was mentioned was that most of the times these children from the city visit their parents in the villages to give them something, especially food, despite sending them money, which it was easy to do. But apart from that, instead of just sending them money, usually they would go maybe once or twice a year to chat with them and bring them a variety of foods. Because just sending them money, they always buy the same type of food. So food choices was also affected in that particular manner. And also, even to them, they would indicate that most of the times when they go to the villages, they bring back certain foods which are not found in the cities. So also their choices or the variety of food that they could get during this period of time was actually reducing. Then there's also increased responsibilities to support the struggling parents and also relatives. And my study found that the people that I talked to, about 63% were actually breadwinners to their parents and also relatives. So their reduced income activity had also reduced the support that they usually give to their parents and also relatives. They also mentioned reduced moral support from friends and relatives. And then there was also increased the use of social media platforms because they couldn't interact physically. So there was increased use of social media platform for communication, which one of the impact was that it increased the cost of internet or expenditure on data, which actually reduced their expenditure on food, which they could spare some money in that particular manner. Some also reported reduced productivity working from home. because one of the measures was working from home. So they reported that during the time, there was actually reduced productivity because when they go to work, there was sharing of information, supervision, which was important for them to continue and do their work. So these were reduced during this particular time. Now, the other measure, for example, the measure of wearing face masks, it turned out there were several impacts that came with it. For example, people couldn't access supermarkets to buy food if they don't have a face mask. I can give a practical example. One day I was just walking into a supermarket, and outside I met a lady who was just waiting there. She didn't have a face mask. She couldn't go inside. Now when one lady was coming out, she recognized this lady, and she actually asked this lady to borrow her the mask so that she could wear it and then go inside and buy food. So what happened is that this limited the choices of food that people can access because they couldn't go into the supermarket to buy food. So what it means, they only have options of the food that are found in local markets and not more choices that they could get from supermarkets. But also, in terms of wearing masks, one thing it did was it exposed what were the class differences that exist. Yeah, because there were a certain group of people who could afford to buy a mask, others couldn't. And others could even say, I would rather use the money to buy food other than use the money to buy a face mask. So it kind of brought those issues, apart from other issues, to say if you're wearing a face mask, people would look at you like you have the disease itself, or they would be running away from you, all those things. So it also brought issues of stigma and discrimination. Yeah. And then the other issue, one of the measure was closing schools. So this also brought some impacts. For example, it increased expenditure on food. This was really mentioned to say now everyone is at home, and we need to buy more food to accommodate everyone that is at home. And even food, I would say wastage was high during this time, and this was also one of the things. The other thing that came up with closing schools was the increased incidences of pregnancies among among girls, because they stayed a long time at home. Most of them got pregnant, and also working from home increased expenditure on food because people would. One of the respondents indicated that if I go to work, most of the times I would eat at work, so I don't have to eat at home. Most of the times, maybe I just grab a small meal on the go, and that's it. But staying at home means you could eat all the 3 meals and also in between meals. Hence, the expenditure on food was actually increasing. There was also an issue of increased prices of certain foods, lemon, ginger, garlic. These were believed to say, okay, if you take a concoction of these, you actually increase your immunity to the pandemic. So, for example, the prices of lemon increased by almost 200%. So that's what happens. Lastly, I would also just want to talk about issues of food wastage, because with the COVID and you want to reduce the number of moving out, most people would resort into buying in bulk. So by buying in bulk, most of the food was being wasted because people would be like, we have a lot of food that is available. So I think this is what I could say to say there were so many issues happening with COVID-19, and especially because of the measures that were being implemented at household level as well as at individual level. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Loveness, for this really insightful presentation, and we will come back to it in the Q&A session. Thank you so much. So now Dr. Nkumbu Nalvimba will be the second speaker. Nkumbu, can you hear me? Nkumbu, can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, over to you now.
Hello.
You have 10 minutes. Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Ramad. So Zambia has not been spared from the pandemic, from the COVID-19 pandemic. As at yesterday, Zambia had recorded 1,000 of deaths. A number of measures have been put in place by the government. Of course, the COVID-19 has had a number of impacts on the economy, mainly job losses, especially in the tourism sector, and a number of livelihoods have been lost in the country. So as a response to the COVID, in March last year, the president, in one of his address to the nation, he stated that the country has entered into a new normal. Every dark cloud has a silver lining. And he further went on and indicated that the current situation that we find ourselves in opens a new window of opportunity for Zambian farmers to produce and sell their products to chain stores that have for a very long time. He indicated that he was therefore directing the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry to ensure that the chain stores prioritize local agricultural commodities in their localities. I must mention that from the time the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, Zambia has never entered into a lockdown. The president indicated that the country would not enter into any lockdown as this would create a lot of problems. Research focused on small-scale farmers in relation to, specifically, I looked at the opportunities and prospects for small. So firstly, the supply chains. I must mention there are mainly two marketing channels. This includes open markets and supermarkets or chain stores. So from the study, I found that indigenous supermarkets purchased produce from the small-scale farmers, while the chain stores, mainly from South Africa, purchased through brokers. As we all know, the choice of the marketing channel by farmers has a direct impact on incomes that are earned by the farmers. The supermarkets are generally considered to have more lucrative, are considered to be more lucrative than the open markets. So in my study, I interviewed a number of chain stores, and what was coming out in terms of the major impact from the COVID-19 pandemic is that most of the super chain stores experienced low sales. I can give an example of one of the super chain stores in the Eastern Province. Their sales went down by almost 50%. And this is because they mainly supplied their commodities to South Luangwa National Park. But because of the low number of tourists in the country, they were not able to supply. So you find that previously they were able to buy from, say, about 40 farmers, but with the COVID-19 crisis, they were only able to buy from 15 local farmers. Then the supermarket also indicated, like, from the 100 kgs of tomatoes that they were buying, this had to be reduced to about 10 to 15 kgs of tomatoes. So we see that as much as there was this
Hello, Nkumbu? Hello? Nkumbu, can you hear us?
Directive from the government that the super chain stores should be able to buy local produce from the farmers, we find that there's
Okay, so Nkumbu, we'll come back to you in a few minutes. For now, let's
also.
Okay, let's try a final time. If it doesn't work, Charity, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Nkumbu. We'll see if we can hear you. One final time.
Okay. So, as a result, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we actually see that a number of chain stores have closed down in Zambia. These are chain stores from South Africa. And for example, for Spar, currently only 4 outlets are remaining in Zambia. And we also saw that Food Lovers also closed most of their stores in the country. This is because of the high cost of running a business compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, the low sales. Am I clear? Can I continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so when I looked at the other chain store, ShopRite, I found that whilst they indicated that they buy products from smallholder farmers, I found that they actually use a subsidiary, Freshmark, to buy that produce from the small-scale farmers. And they require very high standards of the agriculture produce. So in terms of the kind of farmers that they really buy from, they cannot really be considered to be small-scale farmers. These are farmers who are actually in the urban or peri-urban areas. So we see that this benefit is accruing more to these farmers who are in the urban areas, whilst those in the rural areas, who are the majority, do not have access to this market. So for example, when I talked to ShopRite Livingston, they indicated that they buy from local farmers, but those local farmers that they talked about were actually white farmers. So we see that the smallholder farmers in rural areas have failed to penetrate this market. Then in addition, whilst other chain stores like Choppies, which originates from Botswana, have tried to buy directly from the small-scale farmers, they have faced challenges because there's been some inconsistency and sometimes the farmers are not able to meet the demand. So we see that there are issues of skills in terms of quality management. The farmers lack pricing structures and also financial management skills. So going to the question that I tried to answer, are we seeing any agrarian transformation amongst the smallholder farmers amidst this pandemic? As previously noted, the pandemic quite okay presents a window of opportunity for smallholder farmers in Zambia to actually transform their agriculture production patterns. However, this transformation will be based on embracing improved production techniques and accessing better markets. So what we see is that as much as there's been this pronouncement by the government to actually push chain stores to buy from the smallholder farmers, they are not able to meet the demand. Hence, the transformation still lags behind due to a number of reasons, and some of them actually include policy issues. I noted that the narrative earlier on, that the narrative of a golden opportunity for smallholder farmers, which talks about unique agriculture opportunity to replace imported products, is spearheaded by actually the government and farmer representatives without any proper policy guidelines to implement, to see how this is going to be implemented on the ground level. For example, some of the retail outlets that I talked to noted that they did not have any policy guidelines on who to procure, on who exactly or how to procure from the farmers and under what terms. And therefore, we find that this golden opportunity, as I earlier stated on, is actually being captured by the peri-urban or urban local capitalized farmers who have the networks. I interviewed some farmers who indicated that whilst they're able to supply to ShopRite, they've been able to supply to these chain stores because they were actually introduced by some South African farmers. So we continue to see that it's been very difficult for smallholder farmers from rural areas to actually penetrate these markets. And given the fact that a large number of the population constitutes peasant farmers, I also argue that it's not possible for all these supermarket chains to buy from all these farmers. Therefore, it is important that maybe these farmers could form cooperatives and explore other markets apart from the chain stores. The government probably needs to strategize on how the smallholder farmers can be incorporated into these value chains so that they can actually gain better profits. I would love to give one case on onions that happened recently. In order to actually promote, to help farmers supply their products to chain stores, the government banned the importation of onions into the country 2 months ago. However, just within 1 month, the country ran out of onions. There was a huge shortage of onions. So we find the government now lifting the ban and allowing the importation of onions from South Africa. So we see that within this prism of ensuring market stability in the new normal, the Zambian government is actually faced with this paradox where it needs to have measures to address the deficit in the short term and also measures to boost the production and meet the market demand. Then considering that most of the small-scale farmers are quite vulnerable, there is need for the government to actually help these farmers with credit and also infrastructure in terms of irrigation and say other processing equipment. Otherwise, without much investment into the smallholder farmers, we will not be able to see this transformation amidst this COVID-19 crisis. Let me end there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nalwimba. This was a very, very insightful presentation. And we'll come back to some of the key findings that you have shared with us shortly. So you agree that the pandemic presents an opportunity of transformation, a window of opportunity for smallholder agriculture in Zambia. But the question is, how can this be sustained? Now we move on to Ms. Charity Rizere, who will be presenting on the impact of the Zimbabwe Fast Track Land Reform Program and in the context of COVID-19. Over to you, Charity. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Rama. For Zimbabwe, there are some differences with Zambia and Malawi, because Zimbabwe, it introduced a mix of measures for including lockdown to curb the spread of the coronavirus, but I'll talk about it in my presentation. So COVID also proved to be a multidimensional issue. It not only affected the health sector, it also affected the social, economic, and political sectors. And the pandemic had impact on the food systems in Zimbabwe, fundamentally, which came down to 2 ways. Number one, it caused an economic recession with some companies going bankrupt and some people losing their jobs and also losing incomes. This affected the demand side of the customers. And the second one was the disruptions in the food supply systems. And so agriculture as a whole, it affected the agricultural sector's immediate and long-term economic functioning, and it also affected the food security status of the country. But the impact of the COVID-19, it was quite heterogeneous. It affected different food systems differently and also depending on the environments. But what I also observed in my study was that it also affected different households differently. So for Zimbabwe, to prevent and control COVID-19, the government adopted some mitigating measures beginning 2020 in March last year to curb the spread of the disease. These include a mix of the enforcement of national lockdowns, and Zimbabwe just came out of a national lockdown recently. It also included prohibition, limitation of gatherings, implementation of curfews, and the restriction of inter-provincial and intercity travel, among others. So daily necessities such as fresh vegetables, they experienced a serious knock on the production and marketing sides due to the sudden changes, highlighting the vulnerability of the sector. So on the production side, information that I got from the farmers that I spoke to, the data came out on a number of variables such as mobility, area allocation to crops, growing cycles, and on labor. So mobility affected both the production side and the marketing side. Initially, mobility challenges were due to travel restrictions, especially in the first 3 weeks of the national lockdown. A lot of businesses were closed, including farmer markets, restaurants, hotels, supermarkets, and schools. And initially, farmers were not considered to be essential services. And so when the farmers that I spoke to, 66% of them indicated that initially, at the start of the lockdown, they were not affected in terms of inputs purchasing. They'd already bought their needed inputs before the lockdown, but the others were caught unawares and restrictions impeded their access to inputs, and they had resort to buying their inputs costly on the parallel market. And still on production, at the early stages of the national lockdown, farmers did not have enough time to adjust to production patterns. Land allocations, clearing, planting, and other agricultural production activities had already begun. And so there was not much that they could do before when the lockdown was implemented. Generally, there was no significant change immediately, but slight adjustments were made during 2020 as the pandemic became more widespread. Farmers had not anticipated a severe impact on the short term, so land sizes were not affected. In terms of the growing cycles, they were not significantly affected, although farmers did make adjustments in their cropping areas. They maintained their growing cycles over the year. In terms of labor, still on the production side, farmers faced a temporary cessation in production. But after a few weeks of lockdown, the Ministry of Agriculture made an announcement to approve farm workers to continue working on farms as long as they practiced hygiene procedures. These include wearing of masks, washing the hands, and so there was not much labor disruptions after the announcement because a lot of the farm workers, they live nearby the farms, so they were not affected by the lockdowns. But social distancing meant that farmers had to restrict number of labor force performing any activity at any particular point in time. And this resulted in reduced production per person, and it heavily impacted on the activity turnaround time, which became a bit lengthier. It also increased production costs and putting pressure on farmers' cash flows. Both the farmer and the farm workers, they also experienced emotional burden due to the pandemic. On the marketing side, initial stages of lockdown, like I mentioned earlier on, shops, businesses, schools, restaurants, they were all closed. So it meant that customers, vendors, middlemen, they could not come to buy produce. Farmers were also not considered as essential services at the initial stage of the initial lockdown, but so they could not access their markets to sell harvested produce. This resulted in huge loss and waste due to localized surplus. And a lot of farmers that I spoke to, they indicated that they do not have storage facilities. So a lot of perishables, such as tomatoes, cabbages, green leafy vegetables, they were rotting in the farms, and they lost at least 20% of their harvested crops. And later on, as travel restrictions relaxed, markets opened, but social distancing still meant that there was still limited operation, which affected incomes for the farmers. On the marketing side, there was also a change in the consumption buying behavior of the consumers. Closure of various businesses meant that there was reduced economic activities, and a lot of farmers, they stayed away from their markets. It affected both poor and high income households, and then affecting their incomes. This caused a decline in disposable income, particularly those who are self-employed, who make a significant proportion in Zimbabwe. For the poor, it was also worsened by the fact that they did not have options to fall back on in terms of income generation. The Zimbabwean government did not provide assistance to compensate for lost incomes, and there were also no social protection programs to assist towards overall nutrition and health well-being. A decline in disposable income also led to a change in consumption habits in response to the COVID-19. Major changes came in with consumers buying, reducing their agricultural produce, especially maybe the fresh produce, maybe going towards more drier products, which have low shelf life, such as dried beans, soya beans, flour, maize meal, and pasta. This was at the initial stages of the lockdowns, but then variations came in as the year went through. In turn, also farmers struggled to sell their produce, causing surpluses to accumulate. Another aspect that was experienced by the farmers was on the side of prices. There were quite huge variations in terms of prices at different stages of the pandemic compared to 2019, when prices were a bit more stable before the pandemic. Different price structures illustrate also the heterogeneity of the pandemic's impact, because a lot of farmers had different price structures depending on the markets that they are selling to, and also the times that they were selling to. The farmers that were selling to supermarkets had different price structures to those that were selling maybe to the neighboring areas. But the common thread across the food system was that within the fresh vegetable sector was that the prices dropped by 50% for most of the crops. But for the farmers that were growing butternut and onions, which are a bit less perishable, it gave the farmers some time to bargain in terms of the prices. So they appeared to be a bit better off. So in terms of responses, some farmers made some changes to adapt to the COVID-19. 83% said that they did adjust their area allocation to crops. For example, some farmers that were growing cabbages, initially at the start of the lockdown, they mentioned that they had already planted about 5,000 heads of cabbages. But then during the mid-year, they dropped the number of cabbages to about 2,000. Then later on towards the end, they increased because people were moving around, and they increased to about 1,800. And in terms of growing cycles, only 16% of the farmer respondents adjusted their growing cycles. They didn't make much changes in terms of growing cycles. But this could also be an indication that they remained hopeful of the situation getting better, and they maintained their growing cycles. It also indicates that perhaps farming is their main livelihood, and they persevere even amidst a pandemic. Another response was in actively seeking new markets to compensate for demand loss from lower sales. They went to seek for markets in neighboring township communities and neighborhoods that they normally never sold to. And sometimes it was illegal because there were still restrictions. And for the farmers who did not own vehicles, they just waited for vendors or customers to come to their farms to buy. They also mentioned that they did a lot of door-to-door marketing and home deliveries to improve their sales. And also another mention was that although there is social media marketing growth in Zimbabwe via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, a lot of farmers made mostly use of WhatsApp through marketing WhatsApp groups. They formed databases where they put different numbers of their customers, and then they would advertise their goods and get orders on the platform. They also mentioned that word of mouth was a very powerful method for their business. But also in terms of responses, some farmers mentioned that they were now selling a fuller basket to their customers. It's also debatable what a full basket is. But then some farmers mentioned that this included tomatoes, onions, green vegetables, and green pepper, so that they would offer their customers some variety when they sell. Some farmers also mentioned they resorted to agro-processing through drying leaf vegetables to enhance shelf life and reduce post-harvest losses. And in conclusion, I sort of looked at the impact of the pandemic and the future implications in the short term, medium, and the long term. So the short term and the medium term implications of food loss and waste were mostly due to logistical challenges and the reduction in the demand of fresh vegetables. Over the long term, the farmers may also need to identify ways of reducing post-harvest losses. Consumers are also going to reevaluate their spending and consumption patterns with the aim of reducing waste. The demand to be caused by this impact of COVID-19 on food security and livelihoods of farmers will be dependent on policy measures exercised by the government over the short, medium, and the long terms. In the short term, Zimbabwe is confronted with handling the numerous demands of responding to the health crisis and managing the shock that it has caused to the economy, and also balancing it with the need to protect livelihoods. In Zimbabwe, the government has focused on the management of the health crisis through enforced regulations. Currently, there are some vaccination rollouts that are taking place. In the medium and long term, more effort is going to be required in planning to ensure that Zimbabwe's food security through a functioning food system and improved livelihoods of small farmers. And it is also an opportunity for the country to accelerate its much needed economic and political transformations to improve business environment. It's also critical to look at other food systems, including livestock, grain sector, and non-food crops as well. Zimbabwe also needs to look at, there's also an opportunity for the reduction of food losses and waste post-harvesting through the development of perhaps maybe solar-powered cold rooms or cold-up facilities to allow farmers to properly manage their food goods. And also in my final point is there's also an opportunity for innovation and growth in the food sector through the investment in digital communication for farmers to capitalize on e-commerce. Government and private sector needs to work together on that to improve farmers' access to these technologies. Current mobile tariffs also need to be regulated to improve access by the farmers. Thank you so much. This is it for now.
Thank you so much, Charity. This was a very incisive presentation that you made. Thanks for sharing the impact on production and on marketing of COVID-19 on the households. And also thanks for sharing what the implications might be and what policy measures the government should take in the short term, but also in medium and long term. Thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions, and I can see that you have anticipated on some of those, especially the question posed by Samuel Olowogbon, who was asking about the coping mechanism that the farmers had adopted. So thank you for answering that question already. So I will just go through some of the questions that we have had and ask you, panelists, please to address them. So I can see at 12:44 a question to Charity asking whether you were able to identify, no, that one I already asked you. How did the state respond to farmers who defied lockdown and tried to sell their fresh products in informal markets? That one is for Charity. We also have a question asking about whether the State Department purchasing directly from the farmers, whether it is the State Department purchasing directly through the farmers, especially smallholders during the time of COVID. And if that is the case, what is the extent of that? That's from Molatelo Mohale. The first question, I think, which is also for all three of you that we received, was asking, it's from Constance Mogale, what kind of systematic change can you propose for future resilience to disaster in Africa in your respective countries? And I will ask because I think Charity did highlight some of the policy implications, but if you, Nkumbu and Loveness, you could also you could respond to address those questions, the policy implications of the impact of COVID-19, and also whether the impact you have analyzed are gendered. That's also a question from Constance Mugale, and whether it affected different classes of traders, farmers differently. What are the differentiated impacts on different groups of populations of the crisis? So I think we have 3 questions now. I'll just add a final one because we are running very late. How have different market structures, namely formal versus informal, affected farmers? So I think generally it's about looking at the similarities and differences between the different classes of respondents that you have identified, walking us through the policy implications that you are proposing, but also looking at the coping mechanism in all 3 countries and whether they have worked or not. So who want to start? Nkumbu, maybe? If we can hear you. Maybe not. Loveness, please go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so I think the question that I can address is the first one that is talking about how can the different countries strategically prepare better in future towards the pandemic. So I think one thing that I note is that if we could have a coordinated response, or like we could have a coordinated way of handling the pandemic. Although your question wasn't very particular whether it's a disease pandemic or a disaster or it's another one. But I think a coordinated response to the pandemic, especially among African countries, will be important. I can give an example of my country where the cases, most of them, like during the beginning of the pandemic, most of the cases were kind of imported, and these were people who were returning from abroad to come back to the country. So if we could have a well-coordinated way, I think we would have done better on that one. And I think the government had a lot of time to prepare so well about the coming of them, and they were supposed to put structures in place to ensure, but this did not happen. And I'm thinking that for sure the government could have done better because they knew the schedule in which the people are returning, and they could have prepared much better. And I think also another way to prepare is the issue of maybe putting up budgetary support or preparedness structures towards these unprecedented pandemic in future, because it kind of took us unawares, and in most governments were really struggling to deal with the situation. But if we could have some structures in place already, and also already planned maybe budgetary support so that this when the pandemic hits, we can actually respond to those things. In terms of differentiated impacts, yeah, okay, maybe not the study. My study didn't address that, but I could say that yeah, the impact wasn't the same among the different classes, especially of gender. Women were really hardly hit by the care support, and also the issue of, in my case, if we talk about making sure that the household has food on the table, all those were actually the burden of the women. And the issue of taking care of myself, for example, I had to teach my children because the schools were demanding that I have to administer classes to them. So that increased a burden on me. And I could say that's one of the things. And even just to, when the kids are at home, to look after them, to all that work, I was supposed to be the one doing that. And because everyone was at home, the burden of cooking, the burden of making sure that everything is in place, all that was kind of falling on women. So yeah, it was really the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loveness. Charity, over to you.
Thank you, Rama. For Zimbabwe, at the moment, I think I need to speak in the context that it's currently facing some challenges in terms of the economy. And so I believe that in terms of the country needs to create an atmosphere for business where farmers can be able to sell their produce. And in terms of assistance and support to farmers, a lot of it currently is taking place a lot with more emphasis in terms of production. But I think also they need to be assisted in terms of the marketing side. Farmers need to be capacitated in terms of how they can sell their produce and to widen the base for the farmers. I spoke earlier on about the improvement in terms of technologies. In a lot of farming areas, there is not that much development in terms of network. And we need also a reduction in tariffs so that farmers can be able to play around with e-commerce. They can sell their produce via mobile commerce. They can also do via their transactioning easily without any challenges. I think for now that is what I can mention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charity. And Kumbu, over to you. And I see a final question, an additional question for you, Kumbu, asking you, from your study, can you please speak to the impacts towards women of the COVID-19? Kumbu, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so there's a question on, were there any coping mechanisms small-scale farmers used to offset the effects of pandemic restrictive measures? As I mentioned earlier on during my talk, Zambia didn't go into a lockdown. Everything has been operating as normal from the time the COVID pandemic has started. Of course, there have been some measures instituted here and there, but people have been able to move from one point to the other. Markets have been operating normally. So there were no restrictive measures for Zambia. Then there was a question on, did the different states provide small-scale farmers with new or additional subsidies or else, especially knowing that food aid is punctual and limited in time? In Zambia, as I mentioned, we didn't have a lockdown, except some of Zambia's neighboring countries experienced lockdowns. So for the Zambian government, we have a subsidy that runs every year, and what we had to ensure is that it continues. So we ensured that, of course, for Zambia, we import a lot of agricultural inputs. So the government had to ensure that actually come in, mainly fertilizer and other related livestock inputs. So I can't say that there was really a disruption. Then in terms of restrictions on imports and what the response was, again, I mentioned that we didn't really have a lockdown. Our borders remained open in Zambia. So most of the goods were able to come in, except I must mention that most of the agricultural inputs in terms of pricing really went up. So we find that most of the small-scale farmers were not able to buy the inputs as planned, especially those who are not registered on the government subsidy program. So most of the agricultural commodities in terms of price were quite very, very, very high, and the prices have remained high up to now. Any other questions?
I think that's it for now. We are running out of time.
In terms of
we are running out of time. So if you can please keep your response to 30 seconds, that would be great. Thanks. Nkumbu, please unmute yourself and go ahead. You have 30 seconds. And please, if you can also address the question asked by Arlindo Fortes, are international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank calling for financial and structural reforms that could affect the agricultural sector? So if any one of you want to answer, you're welcome. But please keep your response to 30 seconds. Thanks.
Hello, am I clear?
Yes. Please go ahead.
So for Zambia, yes, we've had the IMF has been in talks with the government. I mentioned earlier on that we have a subsidy program that supports about 1 million smallholder farmers with agricultural inputs. So this program takes up a lot of government funds. So there's been talks with IMF. IMF has been in talks with the government, insisting that we need to cut the cost on this subsidy because it's really affecting the economy. And considering that we are not using the electronic voucher to administer these inputs to the farmers, we're using the direct input supply where the government directly procures the inputs itself. So this has been a huge cost on the treasury. So the government is still in talks with the IMF to see how this can actually be restructured. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Loveness or Charity, did you have any additional response? Thank you so much to our three panelists, Nkumbu, Loveness, and Charity. This was really a very incisive and very insightful seminar. I think all the webinar participants can join me in congratulating you and also thanking you for this very rich panel. We've learned a lot about the impact of COVID-19, especially on the populations, on social interaction, how this has caused a loss in revenue, a loss in productivity. We have also learned from Kumbu how this has affected the market and supermarket sector, and how this constitutes actually a window of agrarian transformation. However, the extent will be only determined in the future. And thanks, Charity, for also analyzing the impact on production and on marketing in Zimbabwe or on households. So thanks so much to all three of you. Thanks to the organizers of this webinar, Syriac, Joy, Andile. There is a lot of background work for this webinar to be held. So thank you so much for having us. And please note that the next webinar will be on COVID-19 relief program for small-scale farmers in South Africa, and will be held on 15th of April at the same time. So 1 p.m. From 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central African time. Thank you so much to everyone, and looking forward to the next webinar. Bye.